You finished something today. Maybe it was small, a task you'd been putting off, a message you finally sent, something you said you'd get to. You did it, and for about 4 seconds it felt fine. Then the list reappeared. The other things, the things you haven't done, the goals you're behind on, the version of yourself that somehow always seems to be living one productive week ahead of you, the one who's caught up. If that feeling is familiar not as an occasional visitor but as the weather you live in, then this video is for you. Because feeling perpetually behind is not a time management problem. It is not a discipline problem. And it is definitely not evidence that you are lazy. It is a psychological pattern. And once you understand what's actually driving it, it starts to lose its grip. Here's the first thing to understand. Feeling behind requires a reference point. You are always behind relative to something. For most people, that reference point is not fixed. It moves. Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill, the documented tendency for humans to adapt rapidly to improvements in their circumstances, then immediately recalibrate expectations upward. You hit a goal. Your brain registers it briefly, then establishes a new baseline. The bar rises before the dopamine fades. What this means in practice? The feeling of being behind is structurally guaranteed when your benchmark is allowed to move in real time. It doesn't matter how much you accomplish. If the measure of enough is always defined as slightly more than where you currently are, you will always be running toward a horizon that retreats. So this is not a motivational failure. This is how the brain works when it has no stable anchor for done. There's a second layer that makes this harder to escape. For many people, feeling behind isn't just a thought. It's part of how they understand themselves. Psychologist Carol Dweck's research on self-concept shows that the stories we tell about who we are become self-reinforcing. If your identity is organized around being someone who is trying to catch up, then moments of actual progress feel like flukes, temporary gaps in the deficit rather than evidence that the story is wrong. This is why achievement alone rarely fixes the feeling. You can accomplish something significant, receive genuine recognition, and still go to bed that night thinking about everything that's still undone. The identity absorbs the win and roots you straight back to the familiar state. The feeling of being behind for these people is not a response to reality. It is a lens that edits reality before it arrives. At some point, most people who feel perpetually behind will identify someone else's progress as part of the problem. A peer, a colleague, someone online whose trajectory seems frictionless and fast. Social comparison is a normal cognitive function. Leon Festinger described it in the 1950s. We orient ourselves by measuring against others. The problem isn't that you compare. The problem is what you tend to compare. Research on upward social comparison consistently finds that people compare their internal experience, including their doubt, their exhaustion, their private mess, against other people's curated external outputs. You see their finished product. You feel your unfinished process. Of course, the comparison lands badly. You are never actually behind that person. You are behind a version of them that has never existed. The intuitive response to feeling behind is to work harder, push more, close the gap. The research suggests this is exactly wrong. Studies on what psychologists call completion anxiety, the persistent sense that tasks are never truly finished, show that intensifying effort without changing the underlying benchmark simply accelerates the treadmill. You move faster, the horizon moves faster. The gap stays the same. The actual exit from this pattern is not doing more. It is establishing what enough looks like before you begin, not a vague intention, a specific defined condition of completion that exists outside your head and does not move once you set it. Researchers who study goal structures call this an implementation intention, a concrete, pre-decided standard against which you can actually measure done. When the benchmark is fixed, finishing is possible. When it moves, it isn't. If you have spent years feeling like you're always 1 week, one project, one decision behind the life you're supposed to be living, it is worth asking, behind what exactly? Behind a goal you set? Behind a version of someone else you've never fully seen? Behind an idea of yourself that keeps updating its requirements without telling you? The feeling of being behind is real. The thing you are behind is almost never what you think it is, and that matters. Because you cannot close a gap that you haven't actually located. The work isn't catching up. The work is deciding clearly, specifically, once what done looks like, and then letting yourself arrive there. If this resonated, if it named something you've been feeling but haven't had the language for, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do for a person is hand them a frame that makes their experience make sense. And if you're new here, welcome to Habit Framework. Every week we take the science behind how people actually think, behave, and change and make it usable. Subscribe because there's a lot more coming.